Service. Before we get started, I just want to share with all of our colleagues that because there are multiple hearings and markups today, I'm going to do my due diligence to keep us to the 5-minute number. That way we can make sure that we accommodate more colleagues as well. I want to thank Ranking Member Thune for working with me on scheduling, on putting this together as well. I want to recognize the chair and Ranking Member Cruz as well for being partners in our work to close the digital divide. Now, universal service has been a critical part of communications policy since Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. Last Congress, we passed the bipartisan infrastructure law and made a historic commitment. We made it abundantly clear that every household, every healthcare center, every school, every community institution, and every business in the country should have access to high-quality, affordable broadband service. And while the $65 billion of investment we made in that package was important, I recognize that one-time investments will only get us so far. We also need programs that can meet the needs of future connectivity and continue to deliver affordability and access to households and institutions year after year. That was the reason behind the 1996 Telecommunications Act and the creation of FCC's Universal Service Fund. The fund supports 4 programs with a proven track record, and the programs are high cost support, also known as the Connect America Fund, low income support, or the Lifeline program, and schools and libraries support, or the E-rate program, to ensure our educational institutions have high quality access, and rural healthcare support, which helps ensure telehealth services are available and accessible in our rural communities. Through these programs, none of our schools, our hospitals, including those in the most rural communities across the country, should be left behind. In the 21st century, we understand that connectivity makes a difference whether our children are prepared to compete globally, whether our healthcare system is well equipped to save lives, whether we can provide equitable opportunities in historically underserved communities, and whether American workers can participate in the 21st century economy. As we come together today and reflect on what we learned during the COVID-19 pandemic and what we accomplished through our COVID relief packages and in the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have the opportunity to build on the promise and possibility of universal service and how these programs should be updated, improved, and expanded to meet the needs of tomorrow. There's a growing pressure on the universal service programs to continue to deliver the connectivity that they originally promised in 1996, as a lot has changed over the last 30 years. For example, in 2023, we know that students often learn outside the classroom. They learn during time at home, during commutes, on the bus to school. And today, E-rate programs for schools, libraries, are restricted to connecting the physical school buildings or providing equipment within the classroom, which significantly limits utilization. 2 years ago, my guest to President Biden's first State of the Union was a student from the Cuba Independent School District, Ms. Helene Archuleta. Before the pandemic, Ms. Archuleta lacked power at home, let alone access to broadband. Her commute included hours on a bus across roads that disappear in heavy rains. E-rate helped her classroom in the past, but it took a global pandemic and the Emergency Connectivity Fund to provide connectivity where she did much of her learning, at home and on the bus. Unfortunately, the Emergency Connectivity Fund is about to run out of funding. Wi-Fi on school buses is still not eligible for E-rate, which means that students like Ms. Archuleta will not be able to use their valuable time to study. There are other simple common sense solutions to improve the Universal Service Program. For example, give schools the cybersecurity tools they need to make students and teachers safe online. Review the rural healthcare statute to prioritize connectivity for patients at home. Work to ensure that connectivity for low-income families is secure. Provide stable funding so that families and businesses can rely on those resources as they make long-term decisions. There is much work for us to get to. We appreciate the panel being here. I do want to take a moment to introduce them. Mr. Tim Chavez, Technology Director for the Cuba Independent School District, who I am proud is joining us today to share the importance of the E-rate program on students in my home state of New Mexico and across the country. Ms. Angie Kronberg, President of Encompass, who can speak to both the history of the Universal Service Fund and share ideas on what we can do to improve. Mr. Daniel Lyons, Professor and Associate Dean of Academic Affairs at Boston College Law School, who has studied Lifeline and Universal Service Fund contributions models. Mr. Denny Law, the CEO of Golden West Telecommunications in South Dakota, and a member of NTCA, who will share the importance of the high-cost program to reach the most rural and hard-to-serve areas in Ranking Member Thune's state. And I also want to recognize Mr. Greg Geis, Director of Government Affairs at Public Knowledge, who has been a strong advocate for increasing affordability and accessibility. I want to say thank you to everyone for being here. I look forward to hearing from you. And with that, I want to turn to Ranking Member Thune for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to all our panelists. The bipartisan principle of universal service has been the bedrock of our nation's communications policies for nearly 50 years. I take that back, for nearly 90 years. And programs that efficiently and effectively further the goal of universal service have contributed to advancements in healthcare, education, and economic development. As a member who represents a rural state, I remain committed to ensuring Americans in all parts of the country have access to communication services comparable in quality and price to those in urban areas. And the high-cost program within the FCC's Universal Service Fund has been critical in delivering broadband services to rural areas like those in my home state of South Dakota. Over the years, the FCC has taken meaningful steps to reform the high-cost program. Under then-Chairman Pai, in 2018, the FCC unanimously took action to provide long-term, sufficient, and predictable funding to rural carriers. By doing so, rural carriers were provided certainty when planning, deployment, and maintenance of rural broadband networks. Today, the FCC can and should take steps to update high-cost programs like the Alternative Connect American Cost Model and the Connect American Fund. Updating each of these programs will play a crucial role in getting high-speed broadband services to high-cost areas. Despite several reforms to the USF, challenges exist today. One of the biggest challenges threatening the sustainability of the USF is the assessment on voice service providers that is passed on to consumers as a fee in their monthly telephone bill, known as the contribution factor. Today, the contribution factor is a staggering 29%, which is simply unsustainable. I've recently joined Senators Klobuchar, Moran, and Hickenlooper in reintroducing legislation to require the FCC to update the contribution system. Fixing the contribution factor is much needed. However, any update to the contribution factor should not be viewed as giving the FCC a blank check to unnecessarily expand the USF programs. It is equally important to address the inefficiencies within each of the programs, a challenge that has been well documented since the program's creation. The goal of the E-rate program is to connect America's schools, and by and large today they are connected. But yet, there have been calls to expand E-rate for uses outside of Congress's clear direction that funding be used for, quote, services to, quote, classrooms. And GAO has recently found that the FCC has not comprehensively assessed the E-rate program's fraud risks. In addition to E-rate, GAO has documented the FCC's failure to properly oversee the Lifeline program, which has been riddled with waste, fraud, and abuse. Much attention has been focused on the rampant fraud within the Lifeline program, but the FCC has largely ignored the fundamental question of whether or not the program is increasing telephone subscribership among low-income consumers. This has resulted in the Commission having limited insight on what the program is actually accomplishing despite millions of dollars being dispersed every year. It's long overdue for the FCC to undertake a fundamental analysis of the Lifeline program. And unfortunately, similar to the FCC's Lifeline program, the Affordable Connectivity Program at the Commission appears to be plagued with many of the same inefficiencies due to the FCC's long-standing failure to make performance goals a priority. So I would caution against dumping billions of additional funding into this untested program. Let me put it this way. I have no doubt affordability programs provide a much-needed service to many low-income Americans, but we need an honest assessment of how to best deliver service to those actually in need. Without such assessment, the FCC is failing to meet its obligations to American consumers. In addition to addressing the numerous challenges that persist within the USF, it's important to note that universal service cannot be achieved without proper oversight of the FCC and the numerous other agencies that have been tasked with deploying rural broadband services. At the end of the last Congress, I began an oversight effort to review the numerous federal broadband programs. and I'll be continuing my work to hold agencies accountable in ensuring that broadband funding goes to truly unserved areas. And just last month, Chairman Luján and I requested GAO conduct a review of the effectiveness of federal, state, and local broadband programs following a report that broadband funding is spread out over 15 separate agencies and 133 programs. And I'm pleased that GAO will begin working on that particular request. As I said earlier, I remain committed to ensuring that all Americans have access to next-generation broadband services and look forward to hearing from our panel today as we review the state of universal service. And Chairman Luján, before I close, I'd like to add that I'm looking forward to working with you on additional hearings and issues of importance before this subcommittee. Senator Luján and I have partnered on several legislative efforts over the last several years in both the committee, this committee I should say, and the Ag Committee, from efforts to free up additional mid-band spectrum to improving the rural broadband programs and disaster assistance programs over at USDA. So I'm optimistic about our continued collaboration on matters before the Senate and within this subcommittee's purview. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank our panelists. And as always, great to have Denny Law, General Manager and CEO of Golden West Telecommunications, in front of this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Thune. And Mr. Chavez, as we go to you first, I wanted to share that this morning I'm also proud to join with Senator Thune to announce a bipartisan universal service working group, which is a group of 6 senators from both sides of the aisle who are going to work together to explore these issues and hopefully find a sustainable path forward that delivers for the American people. And this will serve as one of the first fact-finding gatherings, conversations of that group as well. So with that, Mr. Chavez, I want to turn this over to you again. Tim Chavez, Director of Technology, Cuba Independent Schools, Cuba, New Mexico. Mr. Chavez, floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Chairman Luján, Ranking Member Thune, and members of the committee, good morning. It's an honor to be here to testify in front of you today. My name is Timothy Chavez. I have served as a Technology Director of Cuba Schools for the last 22 years. I'm a native of Cuba. I grew up in Cuba, New Mexico, USA, and I graduated from Cuba High School. After high school, I left to attend college in Albuquerque and was blessed to return to the community that helped shape me. For those of you that don't know, Cuba Schools is located in Sandoval County, in the northern part of the county, and it's about an hour and a half north of Albuquerque. The district covers a huge region made up of 120 square miles. Many of the students live on the Navajo Nation, and they were bused to Cuba Schools over long distances each day. The remainder of the students that make up the student body come from the surrounding Cuba area, which is off reservation, and they live in rural, local, mountainous areas. Most families in the Cuba area have lived there for hundreds of years. The roots of these communities run deep, but so do some of the barriers they face accessing basic necessities. One of those necessities is broadband. Cuba was a prime example of a rural community stuck on the wrong side of the digital divide. Fortunately, the Universal Service Fund, in particular E-rate and the ECF programs, we have made life-changing impacts to our students through the broadband availability that we have provided. We fully support the Universal Service Fund. The dollars it provides allows communities like ours to survive in the 21st century. Many Native American students and their families do not have access to necessities like electricity, water, and internet. The unique checkerboard area, which means sections of land divided between BLM, Navajo Trust land, and private land, make it very hard for easements to get through for traditional solutions like fiber optic. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the school district took on the challenge of getting internet to every single household with support of Universal Service Funds, the local school board, and Dr. Karen Sanchez Griego. Starlink, owned by SpaceX, provided us with an internet solution that avoided the easement issues common to New Mexico. We installed some equipment on the poles in the grounds, and other units were installed on rooftops to, believe it or not, keep them safe from sheep and goats and other livestock that run freely in the Eastern Navajo Nation. Putting them on posts and on top of rooftops ensured that the equipment would be safe and would be functional for a long period of time. Our technology staff at the school were the ones that went out and actually installed the equipment at every single household, and we got every single student connected within the last school year. All students of the Cuba district, like I said, now have a Starlink satellite system. It runs high-speed internet, 230 megabytes download and 25 megabytes upload, which means you could have multiple students on a Zoom session learning remotely at a time. That also means that Cuba students can learn from home on remote days, which consists of weather cancellations due to bad roads, snow, and other things that happen in that area that are unique to specifically that area that would affect the roads, and then also pandemic restrictions. So our students are now connected socially, emotionally, and hopefully in the future financially as we close the digital divide and open up opportunities here at home and across the world to our students. The Starlink project will continue as a school district enrolls new students and continues to grow. Federal funding is critical to providing the resources needed to continue this project, one that is vital to the education of impoverished students of Cuba, New Mexico. We support growing and expanding the Universal Service Fund and E-rate so that other school districts like ours can access the resources needed to meet modern challenges that give our students the education they deserve. I've also provided some pictures, and we're gonna put those on the slideshow, and I can explain. So right there, that first picture that comes up is of a pre-K student excited about Starlink. She's dragging a stick through the ground. You can kind of see the landscape of the area. Next slide. Okay, so this next picture is one of my staff members setting up the Starlink on a pole. If you look in the background, you can see a corral. You can see a fence. The livestock, the sheep and the goats are held in the back. We put it up on the post so they wouldn't get trampled. You can see a trench where the cabling running into the house would be providing that internet service. Next one is my staff trenching. You can see one of the homes. You can see the side of the home, the stucco peeling off. This is one of the homes that does not have running water or sewage, but they do have internet. The next picture is a picture of the staff running the cables. So trenches were dug in all these homes to run the cables into the house. This is a home that did not have electricity. Part of the district, the district's goal was to get electricity so that they could at least run the Starlink system. It doesn't use a lot of power, but we were able to provide 2 panels and a battery pack, and that was enough to keep the Starlink up and running, especially during after hours for homework and overnight. This is one of our students asleep on the bus. Once again, one of our bus routes is over 2 hours. One of the bus routes has 47 miles of dirt road, and that's just one way. And that's a student sleeping there. These are students actually doing homework on the bus. Some of the buses have been equipped with Kajit wireless systems, so wherever there's cell service, they can actually get online and do homework before they get home. This is an on-campus picture, students learning. We have the one-to-one initiative, which was started before the pandemic. For every student received a laptop, like as if it was a book. And it's made a huge difference for our students. The next picture is a picture of one of our typical classrooms. You can see a camera that actually follows, auto-tracks teachers while they're teaching. And then interactive board where they run the Zoom sessions so students can be either on campus or at home and they're getting the same lesson plan that's happening within the classroom. And that's it. Thank you.
for your time today. Next, we'll hear from Ms. Angie Cronenberg, President of Encompass. Floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Luján, Ranking Member Thune, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Angie Cronenberg, and I'm the President of Encompass, the Internet and Competitive Networks Association. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the importance and future of the Universal Service Fund, the nation's critical connectivity program. I have had the honor and privilege to work on the USF for a significant portion of my career, including at the FCC. Encompass is the leading trade association advocating for competition and innovation in the communications marketplace. We represent competitive broadband companies that are building the networks of the future and the leading internet companies who are driving consumer and business demand for more robust broadband. Our members are bringing more choice and innovation, better customer service, lower prices, and faster speeds to customers across the nation. The USF is extremely important to Encompass's members. The majority of Encompass's network providers participate in at least one USF program, and they have a strong interest in ensuring that the fund can meet its goal to ensure affordable broadband across the nation. Our members are also required to contribute to the USF based on their telecom revenues and have had to deal with the increasing contribution factor. While the USF is critical for connectivity, millions of Americans remain unconnected, and too many Americans have limited or no choice for their home service. Consumers want more competition. Competition is the law, and it is key to meeting our connectivity goals. We need an all-of-the-above approach and support from both the public and private sectors to get every consumer and business connected. Encompass recognizes the importance of the USF, congressional funding, and private investment to do so, and I want to thank Congress for its commitment to closing the digital divide by appropriating billions of dollars. The technology companies that Encompass represents are also investing heavily in the networks. In the last decade, the world's largest tech companies invested almost $1 trillion in global digital infrastructure. And each year, tech companies are investing over $120 billion. This is in addition to the billions of dollars they invest in online content, services, and applications. These investments support the delivery of their own content, which drives higher demand for broadband and saves broadband providers over $5 billion each year. Now that Congress has allocated funding for broadband deployment and affordability, some are questioning whether we still need the USF at all, and the short answer is yes. Most congressional funding is targeted for broadband deployment, yet 3 of the 4 USF programs focus on affordability. We must continue to ensure that communities can afford to subscribe to these essential services. However, when we are dealing with taxpayer dollars and the USF fee on customers, we must also be responsible. There are certain USF programs that have overlapping goals with the recent congressional funding, and so it will be important for the FCC to do a deep dive analysis into each USF program to find efficiencies. It has committed to do so, and we're pleased that you're starting a working group to do the same. Encompass is committed to supporting and assisting you and the FCC in your efforts. While the USF remains vital, it is in serious jeopardy. Telecom revenues have declined dramatically. As a result, the contribution factor has increased to a historic high of about 30%. Without intervention, the factor is predicted to rise to 40% by 2025, putting the stability of the fund at risk. Historically, the USF contribution base includes all the services that are supported by the fund, but it has not been modernized to do that for broadband. Encompass has been working with the U.S. Forward Coalition, which consists of over 340 diverse organizations, including civil society, trade associations, and broadband providers, that agree with the recommendation by former FCC official and USF expert Carol Maddie that the FCC should expand the contribution base to include broadband internet revenues. She estimates that doing so would bring the contribution factor down to less than 4% and is a logical, easy, and equitable solution that the FCC has the authority to implement. In conclusion, Congress gave the FCC the statutory responsibility to ensure that the USF is predictable and sufficient. Encompass stands ready to work with Congress and the FCC to ensure that the USF is sustained and advanced in our nation's pursuit of Internet for all. Thank you, and I'm very happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Kronberg. Mr. Daniel Lyons, Professor, Boston College Law School, non-resident, Senior Fellow, American Enterprise Institute. Floor is yours for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Luján, Ranking Member Thune, and members of the committee. Thank you for the chance to appear today to discuss the state of universal service. My name is Daniel Lyons. I'm a non-resident Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a professor at Boston College Law School, where I study telecommunications and internet law. The basic tenet of universal service, that the government should assist those who can't afford access to the network, has long been a cornerstone of American telecom policy, and it's increasingly important as more of our lives migrate online. Unfortunately, it's hard to tell how well the fund's various programs actually achieve those goals. And this is particularly true with regard to Lifeline, a service close to my heart, as I grew up in the kind of family that Lifeline seeks to serve. I spent my childhood in a trailer park, and when I was admitted to Harvard, the first person I told wasn't my parents, it was my friend's mom, Mrs. Zarnick, because I had to call from her house. Our phone was turned off. So Lifeline seeks to address my lived experience. Unfortunately, Lifeline has been criticized as ineffective, incomplete, and unnecessarily paternalistic. Despite a decade of prodding by the GAO, the FCC has never evaluated whether the program is effective. A recent independent audit concluded that there's no evidence to support whether the Lifeline program has improved access to voice and broadband services for low-income consumers. And the problem stems from Lifeline's design. A proper broadband support program would begin by studying low-income families to understand which households are not subscribing to broadband and why, and then develop a system that meets their needs in measurable ways. The FCC did none of this. Instead, the agency simply announced that the $9.25 monthly telephone subsidy could now be used for broadband instead. Even assuming that a $9.25 per month improved low-income telephone adoption, and the FCC admitted that it did not know whether that was true, there's no reason to believe that the same amount would compel families to purchase broadband. Nor does the Lifeline's eligibility requirements specifically target households lacking broadband. Without studying the drivers of low-income broadband adoption rates, the FCC cannot say whether the broadband gap is better addressed by offering, for example, $9 a month to 7 million households or $45 a month to 1.4 million households, which would be the same price. And the subsidy does not address other drivers of low-income non-adoption. So in short, Lifeline bets nearly $1 billion every year that offering a small amount of money to millions of low-income families will somehow reduce the broadband gap, but with no proof that it does, and despite evidence suggesting otherwise. Now, in some ways, the Affordable Connectivity Program is an improvement over Lifeline. It's far less paternalistic. It allows its recipients to use the subsidy on broadband plans of their choice. But it suffers from the same fundamental flaw. It gives a monthly subsidy to a wide range of participants without showing that this will improve broadband adoption rates. ACP's eligibility requirements are even broader than Lifeline. And given that majority of ACP-eligible families already have broadband, it's likely that the taxpayers are spending significant amounts each month on households that are at no risk of losing their internet connectivity. E-rate, I think, suffers a similar lack of rigorous evaluation. The program was originally designed to connect America's libraries and schools, but that goal was largely completed by 2006. So the key question now is whether and how additional spending on classroom technology can improve student learning outcomes. As a law school administrator, I can say there's significant debate in the educational community on this topic, and the academic literature shows mixed results. The few studies that have looked specifically at E-rate show that there's no measurable impact on E-rate spending on student standardized test scores. Through its Office of Economics and Analytics, the FCC has the capability to perform the analysis necessary to make these programs more efficient and effective. What it lacks, it appears, is the will to do so. The High Cost Fund has seen a more rigorous transition to the broadband age and has yielded several significant insights. Through the Connect America Fund and RDOF, the agency is wisely focused on upfront network construction costs, where one-time investment will yield sustainable network growth. The use of reverse auctions has helped ensure taxpayers get the biggest bang for their buck in terms of wiring unserved areas. And it's important that such funds are dispersed on a technology-neutral basis, as unserved areas are geographically diverse, and there's no one-size-fits-all design to connect the whole country efficiently. Finally, it's important to reform the fund's unsustainable funding mechanism. The simplest and most elegant solution to the contribution problem is to fund universal service through the appropriations process. I think other proposed solutions, such as a tax on broadband providers, suffer from the same problems as the current methodology. They're under-inclusive, they encourage strategic behavior, and they discourage the very services that the program seeks to subsidize. Paying through appropriations will improve transparency. It allows for greater congressional oversight of the program. And it would also address concerns in some quarters about the role that USAC plays as the private administrator of a public fund scheme, arrangement that has prompted legal challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lyons. Mr. Denny Law, General Manager and CEO, Golden West Telecommunications, South Dakota. Mr. Law, floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Luján, Ranking Member Thune, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to participate in today's hearing on the state of universal service. I'm Denny Law, CEO of Golden West Telecommunications based in Wall, South Dakota. Golden West has operated in rural South Dakota for over a century, and today we connect more than 32,000 locations across 24,500 square miles. We serve a geographic area larger than Maryland, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Delaware combined, but with fewer than 2 customers per square mile. Despite such distances and density, Golden West and other community-based providers have led the charge in deploying rural broadband. This work highlights the powerful mix of community commitment, entrepreneurship, private capital, and effective programs like the Federal Universal Service Fund, or USF. I'm proud of the unparalleled work of Golden West and its fellow rural broadband providers, but there are customers in outlying rural areas that still need better broadband, and in other rural areas not fortunate enough to be served by community-based operators, the connectivity gap is much greater. Finally, even where robust networks exist, we must sustain and upgrade them to keep pace with demand and deliver affordable services. If there's one point that I hope this subcommittee might take away from my testimony, it's that the mission of universal service is not accomplished merely when a network has been built. Universal service is evolving and it's ongoing, and it's a mission that requires renewed focus and attention every day. I think it's helpful to view the USF programs as aiming toward not just one goal of deployment, but rather 4 more comprehensive goals. The first is availability. While not providing upfront construction capital, the high-cost USF program makes the business case for rural investment possible. It provides a more reasonable assurance of the ability to recover both capital and operating expenses. The second is capability. We've seen USF programs in the past aim for incremental goals that create the need to reinvest only a few years later. We need to learn from the lessons of the past and aim higher and more efficiently with our USF resources over time. The third is affordability. The statutory goal of universal service is that rural customers pay rates reasonably comparable to those paid by urban users. The high-cost USF promotes this outcome by helping to cover some of the difference in costs between serving rural and urban communities. The fourth is sustainability. The high-cost USF program aims not only to make sure that customers are connected initially, but that they stay connected. Even in the wake of substantial broadband grant funding, Congress explicitly directed the FCC to carry on the mission of universal service. Several high-cost USF programs offer an effective roadmap to achieve these goals. The CAF, BLS, and ACAM initiatives and the Alaska Plan have all helped small providers lead the charge for rural broadband. We should enhance and expand such efforts to address remaining broadband availability challenges. Moreover, continuing to support these programs is essential to sustain the work that is already done and to keep service rates affordable. Completing upgrades to these USF programs will promote more effective coordination with NTIA's BEAD program. We are grateful that many members of Congress have long supported these USF programs, and we hope the FCC will complete much-needed updates to these programs soon. We must also tackle how we pay for universal service. In establishing a contribution mechanism, Congress rightly recognized specific, predictable, and sufficient support could not be ensured if universal service programs were subject to annual appropriations. We're grateful for the increasing focus of Congress on this issue. Golden West is a member of NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association, and NTCA has endorsed the Reforming Broadband Connectivity Act, introduced by Senators Klobuchar, Thune, Hickenlooper, and Moran, which directs the FCC to reform the USF contribution system within 1 year. NTCA has also endorsed the Fair Contributions Act, introduced by Senators Wicker, Luján, Young, and Kelly, to direct the FCC to study certain demands and costs on rural broadband networks. The FCC should ensure that all who use or benefit from networks and services contribute to their availability, capability, affordability, and sustainability. As outlined further in my testimony, 2 specific steps would help. First, the FCC should use existing authority to include broadband revenues within the contribution base. This would stabilize the base and properly reflect that programs supporting broadband should in turn be supported by it. Second, the FCC should ensure that large internet-centric firms whose business model depends on networks to deliver content contribute in an equitable and non-discriminatory way to support those networks. I applaud the creation of the USF Working Group, and I thank you for this opportunity to appear today, and I look forward to your questions later.
Mr. Law, thank you very much for your testimony. And next we'll hear from Mr. Geis, Director, Public Knowledge. Floor is yours for 5 minutes, sir.
Chairman Luján, Ranking Member Thune, thank you for inviting me to testify on the state of universal service. Promoting access for all people to robust, affordable communications is at the core of Public Knowledge's mission and at the core of my 25-year career in this space. I want to commend the committee and the Senate for coming together on a bipartisan basis to advance our nation's commitment to ensuring all Americans have access to broadband. These investments are historic, but more remains to be done because, like our networks, the mission of universal service continues to evolve. We are pleased to learn about the committee's work on a USF working group, but the FCC, the expert agency Congress has charged by Congress with ensuring universal service, must also begin working to meet the goals it laid out in the Future of USF report. Those call for promoting universal deployment, affordability, adoption, availability, and equitable access to broadband throughout the United States. We could not agree more. My testimony will focus on 3 areas: affordability, deployment, and funding reform. Regarding affordability, the Reagan administration created the Lifeline program to connect low-income families to the phone system because, quote, access to telephone service has become crucial to full participation in our society and economy. Wow, that sounds really familiar. Over the years, the FCC has expanded the program to support mobile service and broadband, and it's taken concrete steps to help ensure those enrolled are eligible. However, the support amounts in Lifeline are simply not enough. The Affordable Connectivity Program, which Congress established in the Infrastructure Act, promotes access to broadband for low-income people through a $30 a month subsidy amount. It's a huge success, serving over 17 million families. ACP enjoys broad bipartisan support from people in rural, suburban, and urban communities. And interestingly, states represented by this committee make up approximately 50% of the recipients of ACP. On the graphic here on the screen, these are the top 10 states by enrollment numbers. We have another graphic that we can put up, and it shows the top 10 states by percentage of eligible households enrolled in ACP. What these show is this program enjoys broad bipartisan take rates across our country. But importantly, ACP promotes benefits for all of us because it drives economic opportunity and lowers costs of services such as healthcare, which, by the way, can help save federal dollars spent on programs like Medicaid and VA care. The ACP is a model for how Lifeline could be recalibrated. It provides expanded eligibility and a level of support that helps to meaningfully offset the current market price of broadband of $45 to $75. It also expands opportunities for eligible providers so low-income consumers have more choices, and it creates stability for low-income families, something Dr. Lyons referenced in his remarks. At its core, ACP strikes at the #1 barrier to adoption, and that's price. Low-income families will subscribe if they have the opportunity to cover those costs. Lifeline should be modified, and the FCC should start a proceeding so that we don't lose the momentum from ACP and backslide. Regarding high-cost funding, Congress, as I mentioned, provided significant funding to reduce the cost of deploying networks. It's important to remember, though, that networks are not perpetual motion machines. They do require people, equipment, maintenance, and upgrades, and the high-cost program must continue to support those expenses. There will, however, likely be cost savings, but we should use those to meet delayed public interest objectives. For example, public knowledge has long stressed the need to make today's networks more resilient in the face of disaster, something I know you care deeply about, Chairman Luján. Unlike the old phone network, today's broadband networks shut down when the power grid goes dark. Long-term funding is needed to ensure that providers' networks are hardened against disasters and that consumers have sufficient backup power to get through those power outages. In the past, the FCC has used funding to help communities ravaged by natural disaster. We would call on the Commission to initiate a proceeding to determine how to promote more network resiliency. On how to pay. Obviously, this is a long list, and I promise I'm wrapping up here. We are more connected than ever, but the revenues used to meet our critical USF mission are declining, and that's because they rely on a base of revenue that they've relied on for over 17 years. As others have mentioned, the contribution factor currently stands around 30%, and that makes these disbursement challenges even harder. That's why we joined with the 340 organizations and companies calling for your FCC to reform the contribution mechanism and include broadband revenue in the base. This would lower the factor to 4%, potentially saving the average consumer that has a VoIP, mobile, and broadband connection between $2.60 and $4.50 a month. In closing, since Congress originally created the FCC, it has always charged it with a universal service mission. That mission continues to evolve as our networks evolve. Closing the digital divide is not a one-and-done effort. It takes ongoing work, and that ongoing work is the mission of universal service. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Geis. I appreciate that very much. My allergies are having their way with me this morning. I apologize. We'll now go to questions from members as well, and I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. I want to start with a yes or no question to the panel. Yes or no, is preserving the Universal Service Fund important? Mr. Chavez?
Yes, it is. Without the Universal Service Fund, students like ours wouldn't have connectivity and would never be able to be part of the 21st century. Along with that, there's other struggles, but at least this is that first step to getting our students on track with other students in the nation.
Thank you. Mr. Cronenberg?
Yes, it is absolutely necessary to continue USF.
Appreciate that. Mr. Lyons?
Yes, I think it absolutely is, and I think that's part of the reason why it's important for us to study the Universal Service Program to make sure that it's following through on its promises.
Mr. Law?
Yes, absolutely.
Mr. Geis?
Absolutely.
Well, I very much appreciate that, and that's certainly a shared goal that we all have, and I'm excited to hear that. Mr. Chavez, one, thank you for the work that you've done for the school district, for the students, and the faculty there as well, and really for the betterment of the community. You've shared how crucial E-rate funding is and what a difference it made and how innovative you were able to be around the school district. Mr. Chavez, Cuba's graduation rate increased from 70% in 2019 to 95% in 2021. Is that right?
That is correct.
At the same time, the number of students nearly doubled to 750 students. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And do you attribute part of that increase to the E-rate at the FCC?
Yes, with both questions, the money provided through ECF especially during the pandemic led students to being engaged even while they were off campus and remote, and the money has just really made a huge impact on our students.
I very much appreciate that, and I think that's significant evidence to the importance of these programs, and especially in a rural school district, not just in New Mexico, but throughout America. Thank you for that. Mr. Geis, I want to turn to you to talk about the importance of the rural health program across America. Today marks the official end of the public health emergency due to COVID-19, but this program remains vital to ensuring that our rural health providers can serve their patients remotely. Mr. Geis, why is remote access to healthcare service so vital, even as we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Thank you for the question, Senator. You know, in rural America and tribal areas, we're losing our hospitals, we're losing our health clinics. Telehealth is literally a lifeline to allowing those folks to stay in their communities. And even without a pandemic, we need to recognize that telehealth is a great way for people to ensure that they get the health care that they need. It also has the benefit of saving costs. So that's a good thing for our federal programs as well. But yes, this remains a vital program. I would say, you know, if you look for success, Alaska has been one of the largest recipients of the Rural Health Care Program, and the connectivity and telehealth that's been afforded in that state has truly saved a lot of those very remote tribal communities.
And Mr. Geis, as a follow-up, I'm curious, with the way you describe that, do you think that there should be funding to expand connectivity in patients' homes, given what we've learned during COVID, especially in the area of mental health? I've really been pleasantly surprised at the increase in patients that kept their appointments or were able to speak to a specialist as a result of these investments.
Absolutely. I mean, the efficiencies for doctors to have appointments that aren't missed, those can't go unstated. And as you know, in your state and other states in the Southwest, people literally have to drive like hundreds of miles just to get to an appointment. And if they had connectivity in their home, imagine the time savings and the cost savings of those sorts of trips. I think it's absolutely something that should be expanded.
Appreciate that. Ms. Cronenberg, many of your members provide broadband access and service to low-income customers. Some of these Americans may depend on Lifeline for connectivity. Others may already have broadband services, but instead go without other necessities like healthy food in exchange for connectivity. Ms. Cronenberg, can you briefly describe how affordability fits into the mission of universal service?
Thank you so much for that question. Yes, this isn't just about deploying networks to make sure that every customer can access a network. We also need to address the affordability issue. There are a couple of ways that the USF already encourages such affordability. We've talked a little bit about them. Lifeline is one of them, but Lifeline was devised during the Reagan administration to be a voice subsidy, and it did a very good job in meeting that need. And over time, the FCC did evolve that program, but what we have seen is that it wasn't really sufficient to ensure that consumers who are low income could get onto a robust broadband service to really meet their family's needs. Congress addressed this. This really came to light during COVID-19. So Congress set first the emergency broadband benefit and then a longer-term program, the Affordable Connectivity Program. That is separate and apart from what USF is already doing to address affordability. It is needed, and what we know is that customers are taking it. Close to 18 million households are in the ACP program as compared to around 7 million households who still take the Lifeline program. Lifeline is 90% mobile connectivity. The ACP, we're seeing more consumers take the home product, something that is more robust, gives them more speed, allows their kids to do their homework, allows them to do telehealth from home. So it is really important. And I just want to warn you all that what we're seeing with this current take rate is that the ACP funding may run out by the first half of next year. So we've been working with a significantly sized coalition to bring light to the good that the ACP is doing and the need for Congress to act to provide additional funding to assure that these low-income consumers won't get disconnected. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cronenberg. I have other questions, but I'll try to get to them later in the hearing. Next, we're going to hear from Senator Wicker. Senator Wicker, floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. There seems to be unanimity among the panel that we can't do without the USF. I think the question is how we put the money in the USF. Is that formula that was enacted before our current era, is that still fair? So let me ask this. Big tech is a primary beneficiary of where we are now in the internet. Meta, Alphabet, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, and Netflix account for over 56% of all global data traffic over the past year. In addition, traditional beneficiaries of the USF programs are just 5 video streaming entertainment providers: Netflix, YouTube, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, Hulu, and Microsoft Xbox. They derive 75%. They drive 75% of the total network traffic. I think I'm correct on those facts, but correct me if I'm wrong. And yet, a disproportionate amount of the contribution to USF comes from landline phone users. So, I mean, probably most of my staff back in their condos and apartments and homes don't have a landline anymore. But grandma and grandpa out on Route 3, New Albany, Mississippi, still have a landline. Is it time to ask the question, is it fair for grandma and grandpa to be paying a disproportionate amount of the contribution to USF when so many other people benefit? Mr. Geis, you seem to want to jump in there, and then we'll let other people volunteer.
Senator, you have made the exact right point. The current contribution mechanism is burdening the very people that we should not be burdening, our older Americans. We haven't reformed the mechanism to account for new technologies that have come online since we last updated it 17 years ago. So right now, we have older people who are larger subscribers to home phone service bearing the burden of this program.
What's the solution?
So what we've suggested and agreed with 340 organizations on, at least part of that solution involves including broadband internet access service revenues in the base. And what that has the benefit of doing, Senator, is lowering the current contribution factor from 30% to 4%. What it would do for that low income or that older American family, if you look at their bill, if they take VoIP, let's say, and they pay $30 a month, they pay approximately $6 for USF. This would lower that down to pennies. And so that's a significant saving if all they do is take phone service.
Who would like to take Mr. Geis on? Ms. Cronenberg, perhaps you'd like to supplement what he says.
I was going to supplement, but if you would
want to. Please go ahead, yes.
Thank you so much, Senator, because I think that this is a really important issue. The contribution factor is incredibly high today, and we have been working with Public Knowledge and NTCA and Golden West on bringing a solution to the FCC that it currently has the ability, the jurisdiction, to address this issue so that those who are facing this high contribution factor will see it lowered. Carol Maddie, a former FCC official and USF expert, has recommended that we expand the base to include broadband internet revenues. USF is being used largely to support the business case for broadband providers and affordable broadband service. Historically, the USF has always been paid for based upon the services that it supports.
And your position is that this can be done without a statutory change?
That's correct.
In 30 seconds, who wants to jump in? Mr. Lyons.
I'll take the bait, thanks. Yeah, so I think you're exactly right that the existing funding mechanism is unsustainable, but I think that simply adding to the denominator is like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It doesn't solve the larger problem, the structural problems with universal service that lead to a growing numerator over a denominator that changes on a regular basis. I think whether you're talking about just adding broadband providers or adding edge providers and how you define that, I'm not entirely sure. Once you start taxing those services, you create structural incentives that rearrange the way the internet works in ways that we can't predict in advance. I think it's much cleaner to simply make the universal service program an on-budget program like through appropriations. That would subject the program to a hard budget oversight from Congress and rein in some of those structural incentives that have led the contribution factor to explode to where it's at today.
Ms. Cronenberg.
I just would like to supplement the answer that was provided. It is important to look at the current statute. The FCC is actually required to have sufficient and predictable support for USF. So a change to appropriations likely is going to require a change in their statute. And we have been working with a very large coalition to drive more consensus for an approach for the FCC to move forward. I'm really happy to say we have so many stakeholders that do agree the FCC can move forward, and we think this is largely going to address the problem that you so well identified.
Mr. Chairman, we're at 6 minutes, so thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you, Senator. Next, we're going to hear from the chair of the full committee, Senator Kemp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this subcommittee hearing, and I wanted to ask Mr. Geis about spectrum in general, about public knowledge's letter to the FCC expressing concern of the delay in issuing the 2.5 gigahertz licenses. What is the, how does this affect customers and rollout of wireless broadband?
Senator, thank you for the question. We did recently file with the FCC on this very issue because the impact to consumers on not issuing these licenses is real. T-Mobile, who is the winner of the auction that gets these licenses, is relying on these to build out its 5G network in a lot of small and rural markets. So as an initial matter, this really helps get connectivity to our rural communities. But secondly, it's also going to be used to help them better compete in a market where we have just a handful of providers. So these licenses are critical to making certain that T-Mobile is a solid competitor in our wireless space.
So we're basically hurting our own process of getting spectrum out because of this.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you for your letter. I also wanted to ask you about middle mile. Last October, NTIA announced it received 235 applications, nearly $5.5 billion in middle mile requests. As you know, we've all been working, the chair of the subcommittee, our colleague Senator Rose, and many others on expanding middle mile. The demand, in my opinion, is not surprising. We should be doing more. There are numerous examples of partnerships, I think, all over the United States between utilities and broadband providers. And there are places from Ohio, Indiana, Missouri, West Virginia, Mississippi, and my home state of Washington. I love the example of people working together up on Orcas Island. So you could see that there are people that want to have service. I introduced legislation with Senator Capito that would leverage the existing grid to produce cost-efficient, resilient, fireproof middle-mile broadband networks. And this legislation, I think, would create thousands of jobs. It's kind of what I think most of our colleagues didn't quite understand when we were doing the broadband. Well, let's just say it's one of the hazards, I think, when people try to look at this in an isolated way. So glad the chairman is having this broader hearing. So what additional investments do you think we need to open up middle mile? And how can this help us build out faster the services that we want to build?
Senator, you've rightly described the oversubscription in the applications on middle mile to the NTIA. Middle mile is one of those critical elements of a network that is expensive and is not covered by USF, except in Alaska, where they do cover it given the unique high cost there, sir. So what I would, one of the things that we've talked about, are tribal communities where they have to literally go through various permitting processes to build that line, plus the rugged terrain, plus every factor that results in tribal and rural areas. These are critical investments that we need to make, recognizing that the last mile doesn't work unless the middle mile is present. And so I don't know a specific dollar amount, but what I do know is that we need to do more. We supported your legislation, just as we would support USF being expanded to try to address some of the tribal middle mile challenges that are particularly holding back those communities from getting connectivity.
How do you think this can be a solution in urban areas too, where people haven't provided? I mean, to me, why? Well, yeah. I'll let you answer. I'll let you answer that.
In our urban environments, we need what middle mile can also be a competitive choke point. And so having more competition and more access to middle mile, more choices for providers so that they can serve their customers with those choices is also a way to foster competition in those environments. And so look, we're supportive. I think in terms of support amounts with federal dollars, it might be a little bit more of a difficult challenge to say that we need to fund those in urban environments. but it is a piece of the competition equation.
Can you describe what is needed in the urban area? Because I think I can, but do you think you can?
So oftentimes we think of urban as fully connected. And the truth of the matter is, when we look down at a more granular level, our urban communities often suffer from similar problems as rural communities. There are lower income neighborhoods that simply are built to, are still relying on an old copper network to bring them, slow broadband. And without those upgrades that are necessary, those communities suffer just as much as residents in rural areas.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Next, we're going to hear from Senator Vance. Senator Vance, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the ranking member and everybody else. This is a great set of information, and obviously I think all of us care about the Universal Service Program, and we all believe in it, and certainly it's very important to the people of Ohio. I want to pick up where Senator Wicker left off, because I think he raises a number of really interesting questions, and as he's pointed out, others I'm sure will point out, Universal Service Fund is simply not on a sustainable fiscal trajectory for a simple reason. It taxes an ever-shrinking base of legacy technologies to subsidize the growth of newer and more popular technology. It's like taxing horseshoes to pay for the highway system, right? And the results are disastrous. Americans, especially older and lower income consumers, are paying more for their phone bills even as the fund grows less solvent. Now, I'm new to this committee, so I come at this with a fresh set of eyes, but I think it's fair to say the time to fiddle with the program is behind us. We should actually think for a much more significant overhaul. We in Congress should give FCC guidance to update and overhaul the antiquated funding scheme. Now, I'm very interested in FCC Commissioner Carr's proposal, and Senator Wicker has talked a bit about this. He's outlined a proposal that strikes me as common sense. And the basic idea, as we've just heard, is to tax the edge companies, the newer technology providers, the people who benefit the most from the expansion of broadband. That is, the big tech firms who have enjoyed a free ride on the rural broadband so far. They should pay their fair share and contribute to the USF. I want to, and I know, Mr. Lyons, you have some concerns with that, and I know others on the panel are supportive of that. So maybe where I'd start here is before getting into whether we think that's a good idea and what the downsides of it are. I'm actually interested in a slightly different angle on this, because Senator Wicker has unpacked some of that. So if the rules and fees were set up in such a way that the edge companies were paying for broadband deployment, would they not then have basis to require that the broadband provider carry their traffic neutrally? And so a lot of the questions that we talk about and the concerns that we have about big tech censorship and whether they're more biased towards one political movement or another, I wonder if this is actually the basis of a slightly broader bargain here where, look, if they're taxed to pay for this fundamentally important service, we should expect them not to discriminate against the various providers and people who use that service. I'm just curious. I asked sort of that question first to Mr. Cronenberg, and then I'd love Mr. Lyons to get your thoughts too.
Thank you so much for the question, Senator.
Ms. Cronenberg, I'm so sorry.
Oh, no problem. Thank you. I think it's important to recognize the significant investment that tech is making to bring global connectivity. They invest in data centers, submarine cables, the interconnection points with the ISPs. And the notion that they're not paying into a system that supports global connectivity to all of these customers, whether they're residential or business customers, is really incorrect. None of the investments that tech is making every year gets support from the Universal Service Fund. We think that you need to really scrutinize the ideas that have been coming, because there could really be ill effects and unknown problems. I'm going to give you one example.
Please.
Today, the FCC doesn't have authority over edge providers, and changing the statute to give them such authority really, I think, could open a Pandora's box. It also potentially could long delay the much-needed USF reform, even when we have so many who agree what the FCC could do to stabilize the program, so that's a problem. But I also wanted to point out one more problem to you, and that is this. What we're seeing is that there's a number of pro-innovative services and applications that are being delivered online. This is why people want broadband service.
Sure.
Right? That's why they're willing to purchase it, because they want all of these great applications. And you know what? It's saving them money. Here's an example. More people are adopting video streaming services today than ever before, myself included, right? But they're competing in a highly competitive video marketplace. Netflix competes for the eyeballs against traditional cable service, broadcasters, and direct broadcast satellite service. And no one's talking about how a potential USF fee on these streamers is going to tilt the marketplace in a way that's going to make it less attractive for customers to be willing to take that streaming service.
Thank you, Ms. Cronenberg. Mr. Lyons, we're short on time, but I'd love to get maybe 30 seconds of thoughts from you as well.
Yeah, so I want to second the point that edge providers aren't free riding on the network in the sense that they pay transit fees to the networks that carry their traffic through to consumers. We learned that with the Comcast-Netflix dispute in 2014, 2015, when Comcast changed the fees they were charging to Netflix. And in exchange, Netflix just created its own private networks. They set up data centers closer to home and rerouted around the public internet. That's the kind of unintended consequences I was referring to earlier. When you start taxing one part of the network and not another, there are unintended consequences that can be, it may be efficient or maybe inefficient, but you want it to be driven by the economics, not by regulatory policy.
Yeah, that's fair. I appreciate that, Mr. Lyons. I take to heart your point that this can be under-inclusive, and maybe there's sort of a broader way to do this that actually is responsive and accurately characterizes what the market looks like. But I kind of like taking the fundamental structure of the old program, applying it to the new technologies. The question of how to do that is sort of an open one. But Mr. Chair, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Vance. Senator Peters, you're heard for 5 minutes, sir.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to each of our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Law, as you're aware from your experience, and certainly I hear from rural Michigan providers regularly, especially from Michigan's Upper Peninsula, which is extremely rural. The high cost of broadband deployments also necessitate ongoing support to maintain those networks. So that means our investment in building out rural broadband is only the first step to ensuring that these communities have service into the future. So I know you spoke about this in some of your testimony, but I would like you to expand on why ongoing maintenance of broadband networks is especially critical in extremely rural or hard-to-build areas, and how essential it is that the USF can continue to play a role in supporting that type of network sustainability.
Thank you, Senator Peters. You've hit on a really a key foundation, I think, of what universal service helps accomplish for rural providers such as Golden West, which is the initial act of deploying the network. It's great. It's a lot of fun to bring improved services to customers. However, the economies that come with that, when you're dealing with, in my example, in Golden West case, the economies that come with a customer density of 1.5 customers per mile of facility, and our network in South Dakota spans roughly 14,000 network miles, route miles. So 1.5 customers per mile of network. There are higher maintenance costs. There are not customer revenues to support those ongoing maintenance costs, as well as there will be components in the network that will need to be upgraded over the years. Not every year, but over the years, the electronics and the other items over the life of that network. And again, there are not sufficient customer revenues, particularly in rural areas, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, rural South Dakota, where we are predominantly rural consumers, not large business customers. It's consumers, whether it be farms or small communities, don't generate the type of revenues that will ever be able to sustain that, and USF fills that key role.
All right, thank you. Mr. Chavez, thank you for your testimony here today. And as you may have seen, in September of 2022, the FBI, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center released a joint cybersecurity advisory warning that a group known as the Vice Society are targeting the education sector with ransomware attacks, and the agencies anticipate that these attacks are only going to increase through this year and years forward. In November of last year, a ransomware attack in Michigan forced schools in Jackson and Hillsdale counties to close for 3 days. That's why I passed the K-12 Cybersecurity Act in last Congress to direct cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency to seek out solutions to this very significant problem. So, Mr. Chavez, my question for you is, how has your school district moved to tackle cybersecurity concerns, and what additional help can the federal government do to aid efforts for districts like yours?
My school district has combated ransomware and other viruses with antivirus software. Currently, there is a program rule that does not, in any rate, that does not allow for school districts to purchase antivirus software. Firewalls are allowed, which is part of the security and content filters, but the actual software that is installed on all the end user units isn't a fundable piece of E-rate. So if that rule change could be made and schools would be able to purchase antivirus software like Sophos, which is the one we use, that would make a huge impact on school districts.
Great, thank you. Mrs. Cronenberg, with funding projects to run out by the middle of next year, the Affordability Connectivity Program, ACP, is top of mind for many of folks in my state. Overall, Michigan's enrollment rate at ACP is at almost 44% of eligible households. Due to the tireless efforts, I will say, of our state agencies and local organizations like Connect 313, Detroit actually has one of the highest rates of enrollment in ACP of any metro area in the nation, with 61% of eligible households. So my question for you is, can you describe how your members have benefited from ACP alongside underserved communities? And do you think a sustainable USF fund could be used to help fund the Affordable Connectivity Program in the long term?
Thank you so much for that very important question. Yes, Encompass's competitive network provider members, they are using the ACP to better meet their customer needs in their communities. What we have heard from them is that this is operating expenses that they can now use to pay for the debt that they have on the networks that they've built. They also are looking at it from the context of how they're going to participate in the upcoming Capital Projects Fund and BEAD. So those are the deployment programs that Congress has funded. And I think it's really important to note a study that recently came out from BCG. They were looking at the impact of ACP, and they've concluded that it reduces the necessary subsidy to deploy networks in rural areas by 25% per household. So what does that mean? We spend $360 per year in ACP per household. That's a savings of $500 per location in deployment. So this is another reason why we think it's really important for Congress this year to be looking at funding the ACP program more long-term, because it likely will run out the first half of next year. With respect to your second question, is it possible we could fold the ACP into the USF system? We think it may be possible. We also think it's very important that the FCC move forward on contribution reform before it did that, because there would be an exponential increase in the contribution factor if they had not addressed contribution reform before putting ACP into the program. There may be some legal issues that also need to be worked through, since it was Congress that created the ACP, not the FCC through the USF. So I think we'll need to be consulting with lawyers and talking about what congressional legislation might be necessary in order to do that.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'll hear from Senator Moran. You recognize for 5 minutes.
Chairman, thank you, and thanks to our witnesses for being here. I've worked to try to make certain that we don't duplicate in geographic areas the dollars that are coming from a variety of now federal programs. NTIA, Rural Utility Services at USDA, FCC. What's the circumstance that is out there? Mr. Law, perhaps, and Professor Lyons, is there enough coordination, or do we see continued evidence that we might be duplicating programs?
I think you can never have too much coordination, Senator. I think that it is incumbent on both the governing entities that are distributing those funds, as well as outreach to potentially local providers or others in those areas to determine what is and isn't available. So I would say there continues to be, I'll say, issues that arise from different funding programs, and I would hope there would be more coordination in the future, and certainly not less.
Professor, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right, that there's a wide range of these particular programs that we've adopted piecemeal since 2010, all of which are getting at the right answer, building up. There's a lot of right-hand, left-hand issues. And so at least anecdotally, we've seen an awful lot of situations where two different providers are being subsidized to build in unserved areas simultaneously because one's being funded by one program, one's being funded by another. More coordination is necessary to limit the instances of that happening. And the other concern I have is not just competition or between two subsidized entities, but also between one subsidized entity and one unsubsidized entity in the same space.
We've worried and tried to impress upon the agencies here and in the appropriations process that you could have an entity that's already received money just recently from one federal program and the other federal program be duplicating it, not knowing the dollars have come. I mean, it's not just geographic, it could be also just layering programs. And the reason this matters, I mean, is because we have so many places that need service to begin with, that if we're duplicating one place, we are damaging somebody else. Let me ask, I think this is a professor question. I've joined—
Try to give a professor answer.
I've joined with Senator Klobuchar and Thune and Hickenlooper in legislation trying to encourage the FCC to make decisions about the USF contribution factor. What are the consequences for telecommunications providers and end users if the USF contribution factor is not stabilized? And there's a kind of a related question. So if we're putting all these dollars out there, does the USF support system, does it ever go away? And Mr. Law may have answered that in his response to my colleague about the need for continued support for maintenance and ongoing programming.
Yeah, so I'll say I don't think there's any question that the existing contribution mechanism is unsustainable. I remember speaking about this 5 or 6 years ago when the rate hit like 18%, and I was pointing out that was the level that of the suckers tax that hotels put on out-of-town visitors who in order to pad the local revenues. And now it's almost double that, right? So I don't think there is a question that the existing run rate is not working. The question is, how do you fix it? And our discussion around the table today is largely focused on the denominator, right? What's the base of revenue that we're going to use to try to fund going forward? But one piece of the solution also has to be the numerator problem, right? How do you control the actual spending and make sure that the spending that the surcharge is funding is actually going toward programs that are going to close the digital divide?
Mr. Law, I talk to my providers all the time, but you're on my list of most talked to providers in this setting. Senator Thune has you as a regular feature of our hearings, and it's good to see you one more time. I got just 35 seconds. I'll direct this to you, Mr. Law. Updates needed to certain high-cost USF programs. I've heard complaints about how difficult it is to deliver in our most rural, challenged places. What would your suggestion be with the need to update both the BLS and the ACAM programs to meet that particular challenge?
Thank you, Senator. I think the FCC has a good record in front of from activities over the last year to update both the ACAM and the CAF BLS programs with a couple of things. One is adjust the ACAM program for, I'll say, today's speed requirements. When ACAM was deployed in 2018, it was based on a lower speed requirement. I think it's time to bring that up to speed, as well as give providers that subscribe or participate in the ACAM program the opportunity for extended funding over a longer period of time with an increased speed commitment over a broader area. And I think the FCC has an ample record to act on that, and I hope they do soon. As it relates to the CAF BLS program, I think a couple of things. One is there continues to be an annual budget control mechanism that comes into play. I think it is very evident that the budget that was set for that very vital program is just clearly too low. And instead of trying to address it on an annual basis, I would encourage the FCC to retarget that budget to the current level. Continue to have a budget control mechanism in place. I'm not suggesting unlimited. Continue to have a budget control mechanism in place, but reset it to target it to today's budget. Those would be the two immediate things I would suggest.
Thank you for your suggestions.
Thank you, Senator Moran. Next up is Senator Rosen, virtually.
On me, thank you for holding the hearing. If Chairman Luján is there, I can't see him since I'm remote. Thank you to him too, and the witnesses, of course, for being here today. And so I'm just going to get right into it. As one of the authors of the broadband section of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, I was proud to help create the Affordable Connectivity Program, or the ACP, which provides support to working families so they can access and afford critical broadband services and devices they need for work, for school, for telehealth, and for so much more. So in my home state of Nevada, over 201,000 households are currently enrolled in ACP. That's why I recently led my colleagues in a letter to Senate appropriators requesting robust funding for ACP in fiscal year 2024 so that the people in Nevada and over 17 million households across the U.S., including 252,000 tribal households, well, we just don't want them to lose access to their broadband services when the funding for this program runs out. So, Ms. Cronenberg, I have two very important questions for you. How important is ensuring continued funding and support for ACP? And what can we learn from ACP implementation that can help us improve other affordable broadband programs like Lifeline, which provides nearly $7 million to Nevada to increase broadband affordability for working families?
Thank you so much, Senator, for your commitment to ACP, and we really do appreciate the opportunity for our member companies to be able to better serve all of their customers in a local community, making sure that they can get connected when they haven't been able to afford broadband service until the ACP existed. We think it is vital that it continue, not just so that no one gets cut off, but also because it's very important operating expense revenue that the companies receive in order for them to pay for the debt that they took on to build the networks. And it's also important as they look ahead at participating in the Capital Projects Fund and the BEAD program to build more broadband. I had mentioned a study earlier in my testimony that shows that it is significantly less expensive to build when you know the customers can sign up for the service. So ACP is critical from that aspect as well. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And you really set me right into my next question, because it is important that we have all of these. And our rural connectivity, our broadband mapping, the BEAD program. I mean, I've made it my mission in Congress to ensure Nevada receives its fair share of the federal funding, especially in our rural communities. And it's why I've been so concerned that the funding through Broadband Equity Access and Deployment, or as we refer to it, BEAD, that might be distributed based on the FCC's they're very flawed broadband maps that show constituents in Nevada's rural communities having access to high-speed internet when they simply do not. It's why I introduced with Ranking Member Thune the Accurate Map for Broadband Investment Act, so that the FCC has time to update the maps before NTIA allocates funding based on them. But these maps are also used for initiatives under the USF Connect America Fund, like the 5G Fund for Rural America, that are really aimed at modernizing and expanding broadband services across our rural communities in America. As it stands, Nevada receives over $22 million from the Connect America Fund, but I'm concerned about the impact that flawed FCC maps could have on future funding. So I'd like to ask Mr. Goose, then Ms. Cronenberg, what impact could inaccurate broadband maps have on our efforts to close the digital divide? And what are your concerns that future funding under these key programs might not go to the areas that need it most?
Thank you, Senator Rosen, for the question. The challenge presented by inaccurate maps is this. This is historic funding that Congress has allocated to address the broadband gap. If communities show up as served that are unserved, they miss out on that opportunity. And that's just unfair to those communities. Now, we understand the FCC is working through a challenge process and trying to get these maps more accurate in a timeline that allows NTIA to move forward by June 30th. And we hope, and we've suggested that maybe there continue to be flexibility even after that date to update the numbers that each state gets. But I think you've highlighted a real concern and demonstrated that in Nevada the map isn't accurate. And so those updates are essential. We hope that the FCC and NTIA will continue to work together to try to increase that accuracy.
Thank you. I only have a few seconds left. Do you have anything important to add, or we can take your response off the record, Ms. Cronenberg?
Thank you. I'd be happy to do that.
Written response. Thank you very much. I'll yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Mr. Law, at the same time, community-based providers like Golden West have leveraged the resources provided by the FCC's high-cost program. Congress has allocated billions of dollars to other agencies like NTIA, USDA, and Treasury to support the build-out of broadband services. Unfortunately, many federal agencies like NTIA seem intent on including extraneous requirements such as net neutrality, open access, and burdensome labor requirements in their respective broadband programs. I recently led the majority of my Republican colleagues on this committee requesting NTIA remove these unnecessary requirements from the $42.45 billion Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, or the BEAD program. So my question really is two parts. And the first is, what do you see as the role and key function for the high-cost program and its statutory mission going forward as these grants from other federal agencies are being distributed?
I think first and foremost for the Universal Service Fund is the backstop it plays in rural America to ensure reasonable and comparable, sufficient, predictable, all of those things based really back in the 96 Act in terms of the services that shall be provided to rural and remote communities such as those that Golden West serves in South Dakota. So I think even in the face of a one-time massive effort of deploying, billions, $42+ billion of capital into the broadband market to serve rural areas, USF and the high-cost fund has been the underpinnings of successful deployment, sustainability, and affordability programs for really, in my opinion, the last 20+ years, and I hope and anticipate that it will be for the next 20+ years, irrespective of BEAD or, I'll say, one-time shot funding programs.
Second question on that is, can you speak to the effects of these extraneous requirements from other agencies on providers like Golden West? And for example, does it affect your decision as to whether or not to apply for those types of grants?
Absolutely. And in terms of, I'll say, obviously, we're in the broadband business, so we have a good idea of what it will take to deploy broadband to specific areas, including areas that many parts of this country can't imagine traveling to, and we'll work to get broadband there. However, what we are not experts on are, I'll say, necessarily parameters of programs in terms of guidance for different requirements brought along that come with those specific grants or potentially with those grants. So it necessitates either adding additional expertise within our firm, within our company, or hiring it. All of those items, or either of those items, layer cost. The other is the compliance risk that comes with it. I would like to think Golden West would never put itself, I'll say, at risk in terms of any type of compliance item. If there's a rule or something that comes along with receiving of funds, we wish to follow that, and it would be our intent to do that. At the same time, the forward-looking risk of what if, the what ifs for the mini requirements that come with some of these grant funds make it questionable for smaller providers if we'll be really willing to participate. Certainly that's for Golden West.
Thank you. Professor Lyons, in your testimony, you discussed some of the shortfalls in the Lifeline program, particularly around the lack of developed metrics by the FCC to know whether or not the program is effective in getting broadband services to low-income Americans. For years, I've called upon the Commission, both under Republican and Democrat leadership, to undertake a fundamental analysis of the program to determine if the program has been an effective means of increasing subscribership among low-income consumers. To date, has the FCC conducted this sort of analysis? And if they haven't, what are the practical effects on actually closing the digital divide?
No, it hasn't, and I think that's a big issue that goes all the way back to the telephone era of Lifeline. The GAO has consistently asked the FCC to do a study to show that the dollars that they're spending are actually reaching families that would otherwise be at risk of losing service. When the GAO prompted the FCC in 2015, the FCC responded with 2 studies, private studies, that in fact, one of which indicated that up to 88% of Lifeline money was being spent on families that were at no risk whatsoever of dropping off the network. Now, that study had a few problems, but it points out the fact that it's quite possible the vast majority of that spending is being wasted in the sense of it is not in pursuit of the goal of closing then telephone penetration rates, now broadband adoption rates.
And are you similarly concerned that the Affordable Connectivity Program has not been an effective means of closing the digital divide?
I am, or at least I'm concerned that we haven't studied whether it is or not. So the Affordable Connectivity Program's eligibility requirements are even broader than Lifeline. It includes any family that's earning over 2x the federal poverty line. The most recent Pew Research data shows that within families who earn less than $35,000 a year, which I think is a good proxy for that, 57% have home broadband and 76% have a smartphone at home. So that suggests that the majority of those who are eligible already receive funding. Now, we've heard quite a bit, I think, about ACP's burn rate, right? The fact that the initial allocation, it's starting to run out. I don't know whether it's true or not, but to the extent that it is a concern, it's an argument in favor of, I think, tightening up the eligibility requirements to make sure that the money that's been allocated and is being spent is going to those families that are either unconnected or at severe risk of losing their connectivity absent the subsidy.
Okay. My time is up. I think we've got Senator Tester on remotely. I've got another question for the panel, and I'd like to direct to Mr. Law, but if I don't get a chance to do that, I'll submit it for the record. Senator Tester.
Thank you, Senator Thune. So I just want to tell you where my world is, and I want to ask Mr. Geis about the business model, and anybody else wants to respond can. Some would say I'm in my farm, I'm on the other side of the digital divide. My cell phone works, but it depends on what direction you're standing, it depends on how you hold your mouth, and drop calls happen with regularity. The broadband service I get is fine, but it's not good enough so where I could actually get on, say, a news program and have it be dependable that I would not break up or actually go away. I spend a fair amount of money on those services, even by my standards, because I make a decent wage here as a United States Senator. It still costs a noticeable amount for those. I was one of 10 people that helped build the bipartisan infrastructure bill, otherwise known as IIJA, where we put forth, I think, $65 billion in total and about, and that has a 75% government share, 25% non-government share for those dollars. These are taxpayer dollars. It's significant dollars. And it's for a good reason, because I think, broadband in 2023 is like electricity in the 40s. If you don't have it, you're seriously set back. But can you tell me why we have the kind of costs we do for broadband service and cellular service, which I have been told are very much connected, when in fact the federal government is paying this kind of money out and the localities are not? And I would direct it to Mr. Geis, but anybody else can respond to that. But I'd ask you to be very pointed and get it done quick, because I got some other things I want to talk about.
You bet. And Senator, thank you so much for your work on the IIJA. As you identified on a bipartisan basis, this was a huge success, and it is an historic commitment by this country to ensure that this essential service of our time is available to all Americans. Regarding price, it's a complicated question. We know that these markets are not super competitive, and in rural areas there might be reasons for that. In urban areas, those are challenges that we should, as a country, just face up to and start trying to address. We've allowed a little bit too much consolidation, and that ultimately harms consumers. And so if we have a more competitive market, we can then facilitate price competition, which should be a goal for all of us, because consumers at the end of the day deserve that from us. I hope that answers your question, Senator.
Well, it kind of does. Would anybody else like to respond to that?
And Senator, this is Angie Cronenberg, and I would like to respond to that. Thank you for your support of the Infrastructure Act. I know that was a lot of hard work by many. Encompass recommends that as we are funding new networks with federal government dollars, that we do more to enable and promote competition. One recommendation that we have had, and NTIA is encouraging this, that when there are other providers who show up and want to get access to the network that's being built by government funds, that the provider who won the funding cannot turn them away. It needs to be reasonable wholesale pricing. We think this is going to bring better prices to the retail customers, more innovation, and more investment in the communities. We were so pleased to see that the NTIA did include that encouragement to the states, and we've been going state to state talking to them about the benefits of, again, promoting competition with these government-funded dollars.
Yeah, and I want to talk, I mean, just from a cell phone standpoint, there are a lot of folks that claim they have service in my area, but there's really only one, that handful, that has service. And quite honestly, as I said before, it really depends on, I don't know, where the sun is or where the moon is, whether it's gonna work or not. I don't know who to direct this question to, but I hear regularly about low or orbital satellites being able to furnish as good a service as the landlines. Could somebody talk to that? Is that true? Are we wasting a bunch of money throwing fiber in the ground when actually 10 years from now it's all going to be done in space? Could somebody talk to that?
Senator Tester, this is Denny Law with Golden West. Thank you for your question. So the low Earth orbit satellites present an interesting question. And that is, I do think that it at times may present an option for connectivity in certain areas. However, I think when you start to look at it as a solution instead of just an option, I think you may be stretching the reaches of what's technically possible. The things you need to determine is what is its performance during, I'll say, load, which is how's it do every night from 6 to 11 o'clock, because that's when most broadband providers see the largest amount of load. How does it do under adverse situations, certainly in Montana, as we see in South Dakota, with weather and other atmospheric things. And then the last item is how does it scale? Because it's all a good discussion to have in terms of what is something in peak technical form capable of doing today. Wonderful. Tell me what it can scale to do a year from now, 5 years from now, and 10 years from now, because I believe that's the networks we should focus on in terms of investment from a federal policy perspective.
Appreciate that. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Tester. Next up is Senator Fisher. I believe she's on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At high level, I want to start by touching on a measure that I passed in the infrastructure law. It would create a unified mapping tool for broadband funding, known formally as the Broadband Deployment Locations Map. The purpose of this new map is to combine data and identify where each federal agency awards funds for broadband deployment projects. And that includes the FCC, USDA, NTIA, Treasury, and a lot of other agencies out there. I am eagerly awaiting the FCC's launch of this comprehensive interagency map, and the deadline for that is next week. Mr. Lyons, given that so many agencies have funding programs for broadband build-out, do you agree that this map will be a critical tool to minimize wasteful spending between different agency programs?
Yeah, I think at 10,000 foot level, it's absolutely right that one of the biggest difficulties we've had in creating a comprehensive broadband deployment mechanism nationwide is the lack of adequate mapping. I think everybody's been on board with the idea of creating good maps. It's just that the challenge is how to do it. And so I applaud any effort that would advance the ball on that topic.
Thank you. Ms. Cronenberg, you mentioned
the tens of billions of dollars that have been appropriated for broadband deployment through the CARES Act, American Rescue Plan Act, and the infrastructure law. Do you believe interagency coordination through the deployment locations map would help ensure that all of this taxpayer funding is maximized so that we are extending networks to as many households as possible?
Yes, so much. And thank you for your leadership on this issue. We think it is critical for us to be able to evaluate the areas that are getting the funding, who is getting it, and which locations still need service. We have one more recommendation, and that is it would be great to have this new map also overlay with the national broadband map that the commission has that shows the unserved and underserved locations. I know they're working hard to meet the deadline next week, and as soon as they're done and they have the maps ready to go for the June 30th, we'd love to see them go another step further so that we can see an overlay of the programs that are being funded with the unserved and underserved map. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a great idea. My focus has been, and the focus of the law is that unserved areas need to be prioritized, and so it is extremely important that we have that information, that companies have that information as well. Mr. Law, it is so good to see you again. Do you think that having this centralized map up and running on time also would prevent the risk that your networks could be overbuilt by other agencies' broadband programs?
Thank you, Senator Fisher. I agree 100%. I think that type of coordination is absolutely vital as we move forward. Golden West, for example, in our activities in South Dakota, we have plans that we are working on for 24, 25, 26 that are all part of our construction plans that we would be able to identify in that situation to properly flag that, hey, we are a federal universal service support recipient. Here are our network either as it exists today or what it will be this year, the end of next year, and prevent duplicity and really needless spending so that we can focus first, all programs can focus first on the most important item, which I believe to be unserved locations.
Totally agree with you, totally agree. And as you know, the Universal Service Fund makes valuable investments in networks in rural high-cost areas that otherwise it just wouldn't be commercially viable to serve those. I know that you mentioned the successes of ACAM and CAF broadband loop support in sustaining reliable broadband in deeply rural areas such as farms, ranches, homes, businesses that are found all across America. In terms of the proposed rulemaking pending before the FCC, to extend support for these two high-cost funding mechanisms, could you explain how it would help preserve the Universal Service Fund investments into the future?
Thank you. Yes, I think a couple of things. I think it would both, I'll say, reset for those companies the necessary speed requirements to bring them, I'll say, more up to date, both in alignment with other programs as well as you know, based on customer demands from when those CAF BLS and the ACAM programs were began in 2018. The other is you touched on the sustainability in terms of the networks that are built and designed utilizing those funds. I think we have a laudable track record over the last 20 years, and I'm confident small rural providers, including Golden West, those in Nebraska, have a great track record of showing that those networks will stand the test of time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Next up is Senator Markey.
Thank you so much, and thanks to this great panel. The E-rate, the education rate, 1996, we passed the big bill. Well, I was the Democratic co-author. Not one home had broadband. Not one home in America. Boom, 4 years later, Google, eBay, Amazon, Hulu, YouTube, boom, the revolution is on. But we knew, which is why I included this provision, that we had to make sure that kids in America could be part of it. We didn't have to worry about rich kids. We didn't have to worry, for the most part, about suburban kids, but we did have to worry about poor kids, blue-collar kids in the country. That's where the E-rate came from. And so far, it's been $60 billion to make sure that kids get connected. It's the first time that educational technology got deployed at the same rate for poor kids as for rich kids in our country's history. That was the policy. So, Mr. Geis, do you agree that the E-rate program has been a huge success and is a critical part of the Universal Service Fund?
Absolutely. It's been a great investment in our future.
And the pandemic helped to expose the holes in the fabric of our digital infrastructure. E-rate helps students connect to the internet at home, at schools and libraries, but not at home. And at schools around the country, as they closed in 2020, 2021, 2022, millions of kids lacked the devices and the connectivity needed to continue their education. And the homework gap is an opportunity gap, which ultimately becomes a job gap. So, Mr. Chavez, do you agree that every child in our country should have the connectivity they need to receive a 21st century education?
Yes, I do agree.
No, thank you, sir. I appreciate that. In fact, last week, the Department of Education released new data demonstrating that students with access to laptops and high-speed internet at home score higher on tests than their classmates without those resources, which only makes sense. And that's why I fought so hard to create the Emergency Connectivity Fund, a $7 billion program that has provided laptops, tablets, and internet services to 17 million students, or to put it another way, to black and brown and poor kids all across the country, right? Just so they have the devices. And those resources are very, very important in our society at this time because they disproportionately lack access to broadband internet services. 17 million kids got access as a result of that provision. Unfortunately, the Emergency Connectivity Fund is rapidly running out of money. Mr. Geis, can you briefly explain what the impact would be if the Emergency Connectivity Fund program ends for those kids?
Well, thanks, Senator. And, as you noted, as the founding father of E-rate and the Senate's homework gap hawk, it's hard for me to tell you what the challenge would be, but I will try. I'm sure you know more than me. But what we did with ECF was to help close that gap for America's children, school children, when they leave the building and return to their home. And that was significant. In the pandemic, it was necessary and vital. But what we learned from that is these new innovative uses can actually be a way to modernize the E-rate program that you have rightly identified that's been critical to ensuring our school children are well educated and suited for the job market in the future.
Yeah, and I think it's a terrifying possibility, both in the short term and in the long term in terms of the harm to children's learning if this fund expires. In the short term, we need to provide additional money for programs like the Emergency Connectivity Fund so we don't abandon those millions of students across the country. And in the long term, we need to ensure that the Universal Service Fund effectively supports student learning at home and at school. Mr. Geis, do you agree that any updates in the Universal Service Fund must protect and expand upon our hard-fought gains on student connectivity?
Senator, yes. We can't have our children's back in the parking lot of fast food restaurants.
Yeah, and again, we know we have a crisis in the country. 1 in 3 teenage girls contemplated suicide last year. 1 in 10 teenage girls actually attempted suicide last year. Young boys are even harder to keep in school in this era. So, social media is a part of it, the pandemic's a part of it, but having access to the tools they need to be successful is a part of the mental health of children in our country. And we know what is needed because if you put these devices in the hands of a poor kid, they have the same aptitude as a middle-class kid. They're just as obsessed. They're just as good at it. But if they don't have it, they also know they don't have it. They also know they don't have access to it. And that's a contributing factor then to their overall mental well-being, much less their long-term prospects for being fully integrated into our society. So I'm going to continue to focus on the Universal Service Fund, targeting these kinds of programs to make sure kids get what they need. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Markey. Next up is Senator Blackburn. Senator Blackburn, could you hit your on button? There you go.
All right, you have me?
We have you now. Yep.
Okay, great. Mr. Lyons, I want to come with you. Looking at the $42 billion that came under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and we're looking at how this money is going out in grants to states to distribute for broadband deployment. This is very similar. We tried this before. We've had it with BTOP. BTOP turned into a slush fund, and it really didn't move the needle on closing the digital divide. So I want to hear from you. How do we make certain that we do not go back down that road with BTOP? How do we make certain that this money that is going to grantees is going to end up going for deployment, and that you're not going to see people coming back later, as has previously happened, and trying to get money from the USF so they can pay back loans or pay for the ongoing operational expenses?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I think it's super important because it gets to the need for upfront thinking about the design of the distribution mechanism in order to make sure that the taxpayers are getting the best bang for their buck. I've highlighted some of the lessons that we learned from the Connect America Fund and the RDOF projects, which is that reverse auctions increase the likelihood that the build out that the Congress is funding is actually going to happen in a way that is at a minimum expense to taxpayer dollars. I think one of the difficulties with structuring the auction correctly is making sure you get the qualifications correct, so that the companies that are bidding on the auction are actually able to do the work that they're professing that they're able to do along the timetable that they're suggesting. But I think you're exactly right that it's important to favor one-time build-out over ongoing sort of OpEx expenses. And I think the way you do that is by requiring bidders to build sort of a net present value of their expected ongoing OpEx needs into their initial subsidy request, right? So when we talk about a rural broadband problem, there's sort of two rural broadband issues. There's areas of the country where it's uneconomical to build a network, but if you gave them a network, then the ongoing operational expenses would be covered by subscribers. And there's a second area where even if you gave somebody a network for free, there's still not enough subscribers in the area to be able to sustain the network without subsidies. I think it's important to focus primarily on the former to get the best bang for the buck, and in the areas of the latter that the subsidy bid builds in sort of an expectation of that ongoing need.
Yeah, let me also ask you about this. The GAO did a report that we got in May of 22, and it was pretty much an inventory of programs that exist. They found 133 federal funding programs in 15 different agencies that are supporting broadband deployment and access. And the FCC alone distributed $7 billion last year for its 4 USF fund programs, $4 billion of which was for network deployment in rural areas. And on top of this, Congress authorized more than $400 billion in funding, including the $42 billion in BEAD money to be used for broadband deployment. So I'd love to ask you, Mr. Lyons, do you think it is important that we stop, that we inventory these programs, that we look at the effectiveness of this, the utilization of the dollars before we say we're going to put more money into different programs? I think that what we're running into
And what I hear from people in Tennessee, there is now confusion over what program they can qualify for and which program requires a match and how those dollars can be used, particularly in unserved areas, which are essential if we are ever going to close this digital divide.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think particularly with regard to the plethora of projects that we have for building out to unserved areas, it's incredibly important that we figure out a mechanism to coordinate better than we are now how these spending projects are occurring to make sure that we're not engaged in duplication. If each of these projects has a limited amount of money, right, then 2 projects spending on one area means there's fewer actual areas being covered. So coordinating among the various initiatives to make sure that we're minimizing the incidence of 2 subsidized providers building in the same area is incredibly important.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator, so much. Are there other senators on the line who want to be recognized? Hearing none, the chair will recognize himself for additional questions. Congress has made historic investments in broadband. Mr. Geist, do you agree that we will only make good on those investments if we ensure that the internet remains free and open with values of non-discrimination?
Senator, thank you so much for raising this. Yes, the internet has to remain a free and open space for exchange of ideas. Non-discrimination is bedrock to that. That's grounded in the FCC's Title II authority.
Yeah, beautiful. Mr. Chavez, can you explain some of the specific improvements that the E-rate and the Emergency Connectivity Fund allowed you to fund as part of your program?
So in my school district, we would not have been able to connect students at their homes and develop the network that we did that allows our students, like you said before, Senator, brown students to connect and be part of this modern global society and be able to learn on the same playing field as other students in the country. Without the Emergency Connectivity Fund, none of that would have happened, and we would still be struggling and trying to figure out how we're going to get funding to provide internet to our students, which is absolutely necessary these days.
Thank you so much. Yeah, there's nothing ultimately more important than the democratization of access to opportunity through broadband access. And what would happen if the Emergency Connectivity Fund expired, Mr. Chavez?
I can't imagine it expiring. I can't see us going back at this point. We've provided internet access, high-speed internet access to all students, and then to go forward and say, well, next year there's no more money, we're stopping the program. I just can't see that. I can't imagine that ever happening, and it cannot happen. We do need that funding for our youth, and we do need to continue moving forward with that technology piece as being a critical piece of their education.
No, thank you so much. And Professor Lyons, I went to Boston College Law School, where you are a professor, and I appreciate your great work as well.
It's very kind of you to say.
When I started here in Congress 47 years ago, and I joined the Telecommunications Committee on the House side, President Carter had 3 graduates of Boston College Law School on the Federal Communications Commission simultaneously as the commissioners. 3 Boston College Law School graduates, and I'm on the Committee on Telecommunications. And what was fascinating is we didn't have a course on telecommunications law at Boston College Law School, which just showed how adaptable we were after getting that superior education at Boston College Law School. But having somebody like you there, will now give all these young people a running head start. So I thank you so much.
It's very kind of you to say, and I'm aware that I stand on the shoulders of giants.
No, well, I wouldn't say that, but I would say that the students today are being trained by giants, and we thank you for providing that service. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Senator Klobuchar. Senator Klobuchar, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Luján. Thank you for also allowing me to get in at the end here. We had a major, lengthy judiciary hearing, and you know how much I care about this, and I want to thank you for your leadership. So I guess I'll start out with Mr. Geisy and Mr. Chavez. We made sure the bipartisan infrastructure law included funding for the FCC's Affordable Connectivity Program. Can you speak to the effectiveness of the program, Mr. Geisy, and how important it is to make sure the support doesn't run out? Mr. Chavez, just what more needs to be done to broaden inclusion, especially in rural and tribal communities? So go ahead.
Thank you, Senator. The program that you and others worked on to create here at the Congress demonstrates that if we provide the right level of support, low-income families will not only get connected, but they will maintain that connection, which is critical to getting the economic and other benefits of connectivity. It has over 18 million households subscribing across the country. States, Minnesota, Ohio, Texas, all are having huge subscription rates and thus enjoying the benefits of that connectivity. The program is a victim of its own success in some ways. The funding that Congress provided that was supposed to last for a number of years looks to be running out potentially next year and as early as May. So
thank you.
Thank you.
So I understand. Go ahead, Mr. Chavez.
So last year when we started this project, I attended a chapter house meeting on the Navajo Nation. And I was kind of surprised that leaders said, we don't want this to be another program where you guys come in, meaning from the outside, give us something and then just stop it and leave us hanging.
Right.
I think it's critical that we keep the funding going, flowing through, especially for like these Native American communities. After all, they are the first inhabitants of this great country. And it's just sad to see how dire the situation is for them just to get the basic necessities. So this is an absolute must for our school district. And at this point, it's just keeping us caught up with the rest of the world. We're not asking to produce money that's going to make us advance more than anybody else. We're just trying to keep up at this point.
Okay, thank you. And I know how important it is. And it's something that's why we work so hard to include that funding from the beginning. Ms. Cronenberg, you included in your written testimony that over 9,000 rural hospitals and clinics use a rural health care program. Talk about why that's so important.
Thank you so much, Senator, for the question. We can do a lot to build networks to reach customers, but we need to be sure that they can afford the service. What we know is that rural healthcare hospitals and clinics are in dire need of being able to reach their customers and to do so they can provide telehealth services. The rural healthcare program is absolutely important to meeting the needs across the U.S. If we were to see that funding go away, this means that the rural health hospitals and clinics are going to have to find another funding source, which is difficult these days for these hospitals already. They're already in jeopardy. So Encompass supports the continuation of that program. And we also support it because it does provide competitive opportunities in communities for competitive providers. That and the E-rate program have done a lot to bring new connectivity options and lower prices from competitors. So thank you for your support of that program.
Yeah, and do you also agree that the current 911 infrastructure is in dire need of modernization? Senator Cortez Masto and I lead a bill to upgrade it.
Yes, absolutely. And I know that many are also working on the equipment that needs to be changed out that has issues with respect to older technology. So we need to be able to fund the evolving networks, the new technology, so that we can better serve all Americans. Thank you.
Very good. And last, Mr. Law, broadband data, just strengthening broadband access and improving deployment by requiring updates that show not just where the providers currently serve, but also where providers have received federal, state, or local funding to build out broadband when their work is expected to be completed. That is a bill that I led with Senators Wicker, Peters, and Thune to improve that access to data. Could you talk about how important it is to have the boots on the ground knowledge to make our maps better?
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for that legislation, introducing that legislation. Network infrastructure is a multi-year process, and so the boots on the ground in terms of forward-looking for Golden West, in our case, we have a commitment, an enforceable build-out commitment through the ACAM program at the Universal Service Program that stretches through 2028. We have percentage metrics to build, but we haven't completed it yet. So we may have something on task for 23, 24, 25, 26. They're all planned out. But if we're not asked that question first by the proper folks administering the funds, you run the risk of duplicative federal funds trying to race to save the same unserved people there were already funds allocated for.
Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you again, Chairman, for holding this hearing and allowing it to keep going so I could ask some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Next, we'll hear from Senator Lummis for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I too want to thank you for allowing those of us who had other obligations this morning to testify. I appreciate my dear colleague from New Mexico. Mr. Law, in Wyoming, like South Dakota, the high-cost program has been essential to making the business case for voice and broadband service. In some cases, in very remote and hard-to-reach parts of the state. In your testimony, you discussed how roadblocks in the permitting process can negatively impact the mission of the Universal Service Fund. Can you provide more detail about the unique permitting challenges you face operating in a Western state?
Thank you, Senator Lummis. Yes, as with Wyoming, South Dakota has a large proportion of lands owed by other entities, primarily the federal government, and that represents significantly the most barrier for deployment in certain rural areas. And it could be that consumers are located on those federal lands, or we have to pass through those federal lands to reach the consumers, I'll say, on the other side. The permitting, I strongly encourage this committee, and I have encouraged other committees in prior testimony, to take a strong look at the federal permitting process, and I have really kind of three very quick suggestions that would be, I think, relatively simple solutions to at least begin. The first would be put a shot clock on the respective agency when an entity wishes to disturb previously disturbed rights of way. In other words, if there's already a road going through a particular piece of federal land and we're going to follow that land, I think there's a different level of scrutiny that needs to be needed, and a shot clock should be put in place. Secondly, agencies should designate within themselves who are the proper contacts for an entity like a Golden West to contact if we wish to go through Forest Service, BLM, Park Service, all of those different things. It varies by agency, and it can be very time-consuming for an entity like Golden West. And lastly, I would encourage any future legislation or guidelines from this body to include words like shall or mandates for federal agencies, and not merely guidelines or suggest, because I have learned that agencies will interpret that differently. Thank you.
Indeed, they do, and those are great suggestions. Thanks for those. Again, Mr. Law, in your testimony, you also mentioned that many of the customers that have yet to be connected by broadband are in the hardest to reach locations with some of the most difficult geographies for deploying broadband infrastructure. What difficulties have you encountered in connecting these areas? And then most importantly, here's the question: do the high-cost program and other federal broadband programs currently contain roadblocks that prevent you from addressing these challenges?
Thank you. I think the biggest challenges are it always often comes back to the economic side, and the high-cost program, I'll say, does a great job of helping companies like a Golden West or a Silver Star or a Range in Wyoming address the lack of ever having an economic case in some of those situations. But that's not the whole part of the equation in terms of economics. difficulty in terrain, maintaining, replacing over the years, all of those different items. I think the biggest barriers that companies in the Universal Service High Cost Fund face are two things. Right now, on the CAF BLS side of the program, there have been budgetary constraints applied to that I think the FCC should look, and it was recommended when they adopted the current budget that they look in 2023 for 2024. What is an appropriate budget for CAF BLS recipients? And that's due. We appreciate the budget control mechanism waivers that the FCC has done in prior years, greatly appreciated, but doing that on an annual basis is not the greatest way to incent network deployment. Secondarily, I think they should reset the targets for the other high-cost programs, including the Alaska plan as well as the ACAM plan, to set higher speed targets, perhaps consider lengthening the term of the commitment for carriers that are willing to accept that. What that does for companies like Golden West is we continue to push and extend our network on an annual basis. Is if we know we have some foundational funding available, we'll be willing to make that investment to reach those hardest of the hardest to reach, such as those in South Dakota or Wyoming.
Your brain is well organized. You laid that out in a way that I could take notes and have some very concrete recommendations. So I appreciate your testimony. I appreciate all of the panelists today. And again, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much.
Well, Senator, thank you very much. And again, thank you so much to the panel as well. I want to thank each of the witnesses for providing testimony today on the importance of the programs under universal service, and about some of the changes that are going to be necessary as well. I look forward to working with each and every one of you as well. With that, I will close the hearing. Should members have additional questions for the witnesses, for the record, I ask that they submit them to the committee within 2 weeks. And witnesses will have an additional 2 weeks to respond. Thank you, everyone.